found and kind of defining as far as Scottish identity is concerned. And finally, but I think only if we have time, but I think perhaps we will, I'll show you a few slides to illustrate some of the things or show you a couple of the places I'll talk about. Now, the takeover I'm talking about is simply the Irish Gaelic takeover of Scottish cultural life from the period between the coming of the Scots, or the Gaels, to Scotland, and the gradual introduction, sadly, of English. Or perhaps the progression is from Gaelic to Scots, which is a different language, to English. But we'll get into that in a little while. But I'm going to start, as I say, by just speculating a little bit on how it came. I'm going to make the assumption that you may agree with me, you can disagree with me later, that in Atlantic Canada, I assume perhaps in Scotland as well, that the Highland Scots did not acknowledge, and perhaps in some cases were not as aware of that connection with Ireland as they should have been. I'm going to read little bits of this and go off on tangents from now and again. Perhaps there is something of a note of apology, as I've said, in what I have to say, because I think that even Highland Scots, at least those who settled in the Maritimes, have not been very vocal about their close relationship with the Irish. My generation of Scots growing up in Cape Breton, this island can't have been much different from what things were like in Cape Breton, was not taught to have the kind of respect for the Irish that our close kinship and Ireland's status as a mother country for Scotland should have dictated. In fact, if you read works of fiction written by Scottish Maritimers, even up to fairly recent times, more often than not, you'll find the Irish slighted rather than praised. There'll be the tavern keepers or the too frequent visitors of taverns rather than the heroes or other positive role models of that literature. I can remember thinking that the Irish claim that they spoke a form of Gaelic, or Gaelic if you prefer, was a kind of hollow, a bit of I wouldn't say phony, but what is this Irish speaking Gaelic? And I wasn't brought up to be totally ignorant of my heritage. I mean, I was brought up to be a fairly interested, and I guess for that age anyway, a knowledgeable Scot. But somehow there was something wrong with that attitude toward the Irish. How did this ignorance of the reality of Irish Highland Scots relationships develop? I'm not suggesting I was ever taught any animosity toward the Irish. It wasn't exactly that. But I would say there was a kind of prejudice in the denial of common origins. And it had not developed, that prejudice had not developed very recently or only in Cape Breton. And I don't mean so much just on Prince Edward Island as well, but in the mother countries. One can see a certain anti-Celtic prejudice developing in Britain as the newcomers, the Anglo-Saxons or the English, pushed the Celts into the margins of, into the margins, into the mountains of Wales, into the highlands of Scotland. It hardly needs to be argued that the English developed anti-Celtic feelings, any more than we would have to prove that the Irish had similar feelings about the English. So this is not an anti-English argument, it's not an anti-anyone argument, but I think clearly the prejudices were there. Perhaps it was inevitable that such feelings would develop as the Anglo-Saxons moved in on the Celts. They fought enough battles, as you know, to have developed these animosities, and that first sort of battle for Britain was long and continues, I suppose some would say. As far as what the English believed about themselves is concerned, and this will relate to our topic later on, there is one irony. The glorification of King Arthur that you read in English literature as the ancestor holding out against the enemy was rather ironic. They saw in him a quality of heroism that the English liked to see in themselves. And of course, Arthur was Celtic, and the enemy were the English themselves. So for a long time, the English held to this idea of Arthur as the kind of defining Englishman, if you will. Later, they switched at least partially to a vision of themselves as the Teutonic originators of the parliamentary system, sort of inheritors of the Roman genius for law and order. The latter emphasis left plenty of room for thinking ill of the Celts, whose genius was certainly not order, or law for that matter, sometimes. At any rate, we see the English thinking of themselves as different from and antagonistic to the Celts. Meanwhile, before the Battle of Culloden in Scotland, the major battle that spelled the end of Highland Scottish hopes for control, before the Battle of Culloden, the Anglo-Saxon element in the lowlands were similar to the other English, you might say, or to the English, if you prefer, in that they looked with disdain on the Celts in general, and the Highlanders in particular, the Highland Scots in particular. After Culloden, the Highland Scots the Highlanders went into decline, of course, the clearances and all of that story, which is a different story. And in order to survive within the new economic reality, the Highlanders had to, in some way, buy into the English system. They joined the British Army, they went into industry, they moved to the lowlands, they did a variety of things in order to try to survive economically. In general, after Culloden, they became non-threatening to the lowlanders. And by the early 19th century, it was certainly happening before that, but by the early 19th century, writers like Walter Scott were beginning to romanticize the Highlanders and work them into the general Scottish identity. The lowlanders had become totally assimilated into the English economy and so forth, but they needed something to set them off from the English in terms of identity. Lowlanders, a good sense of themselves as different from the English. So once the Highlanders were no longer a threat to them, then they adopted the Highlanders and their many elements of their culture as generally Scottish, because that allowed them to think of themselves as different from the English, which they certainly wanted to do. So the bagpipes and the kilts and all of those other things that had come, of course, from Highland, from Gaelic culture, these things became sort of generally Scottish. Thus, the kilt and the bagpipes entered lowland culture, and the Highlanders became a major part of the defining culture of Scotland. But lowland culture, now this is this is a pretentious statement to make, call it a thesis if you will. I haven't read it before, which doesn't prove much, but in sort of preparing myself for talking about the similarities between the Irish and the Scots, this sort of occurs to me. But lowland culture being English, basically Scots and English, Scots in the sense of lowland Scots, the language of Burns and so forth, did not stress the connection between the Highlands and Irish culture, because even though they saw the Highlanders as a way of setting them off from the English, they were still very antagonistic toward the Irish. Underneath they were still very antagonistic toward the Highlanders, or at least some elements were. But anyway, in other words, they adopted the idea of the Gaelic Highlanders, but not their connection with the Irish. The Irish were still on the outs. And I believe that gradually, perhaps more quickly than I'm suggesting here, Highlanders themselves accepted, it was convenient to accept this truncated version of their identity and carried it over with them to Nova Scotia and to Prince Edward Island. In being co-opted into the British imperial establishment, or the British Empire establishment, perhaps I should say, they adopted the English attitude toward the Irish. So here you get the irony of the Highland Scots, who really were Irish to begin with, and that I'll be going through in a minute, developing a kind of at least a neglect and a denial, maybe a good word, of their Irish connection, if not an out-and-out prejudice against the Irish that they had gotten from the English. And again, this is not necessarily anti-English, because the Irish and the Scotch had the prejudice against the English too, so I'm not necessarily taking sides and just trying to understand myself how it developed, and understand myself in the other sense in the process, because this is an admission, I guess, a confession, that as I grew up, even in a family where my father was very interested in Scottish history, and certainly knew about the connection, it just wasn't stressed. And I was trying to remember, my father died some years ago, I was trying to remember his attitudes toward various ethnic groups. And I can't remember what his attitude was toward the Irish. And I think that's significant, because he was a very outspoken man, and I think I would have found out. His sympathies were entirely, of course, for the Highland Scots in Cape Breton, and definitely for the Acadians. But he didn't mention the Irish, and I think that was part of the neglect, a symptom of that neglect. And of course, what we got in the schools and in our reading of English novels further encouraged the split or the truncation. One of the literary heroes of my childhood was John Buchan. I don't know how many of you were into John Buchan at one stage of your career. I don't mean that he was a hero when I was a child, but he had written a bit earlier. But one of my personal heroes, in that I read everything I get a hold of John Buchan's works. And he was Governor General of Canada, a Scot of very great accomplishments in literature and politics and statesmanship and things like that. But if you read John Buchan's novels, adventure spy, historical novels and so forth, you usually find the Irishman sort of dark, little shifty-eyed, not to be trusted. So we were getting that. I would say the Canadian educational system was giving us that too. When I say us, I mean Highland Scots. So we were not, there was no encouragement there to suddenly start exploring your relationship with the Irish. Now, it just occurred to me, what the heck did it do to your, if what I'm saying is true, what does it feel like to be Irish and read John Buchan? Maybe you only read one novel by John Buchan, and that's the end. I don't mean that it's everywhere in Buchan, and the Jews, in truth, don't get very good treatment from Buchan either. And yet he was, I would say, even a great man in some respects. Well, at this stage of the game, if this were the classroom, I'm sure by this time somebody would be hollering at me, or we'd be into an argument, and I would like to discuss that with you, perhaps afterwards, because what I'm expressing to you is something that I'm getting, the Cape Breton, the maritime part of it, is something that I'm making assumptions on from my own upbringing. It may not be your experience at all, and Cape Breton was different from Prince Edward Island in that the island had a much higher percentage of Irish. Cape Breton had its Irish, and some very prominent ones, like Dr. Cody and Jimmy Tompkins and so forth, who started the cooperative movement. But in some respects, they weren't even designated as Irish in Cape Breton. And many of the Irish, as in Tignish, lived in Acadian areas and had Acadian accents. And I grew up thinking that, the McGraws? I was partly Acadian, and I spent summers in a community where I always thought Clannan and McGraw were French names, because the Acadians. So the Irish were not very prominent in Cape Breton. They may very well have been more prominent in Prince Edward Island, and may have been able to force a little respect on the Highland Scots here at an earlier stage. I certainly hope so. You can tell me later. So that's part of, I guess, part of the story of what I want to say tonight, because it's part of the reason why it's necessary to either make an apology or to try to understand and reinforce the connection, to try to see just what that connection was. Now, just a little bit of background, and this slide some of you have seen before, so I won't leave it on very long. I promise I'm not going to go into all of this very much again, because I have I have talked before about the early Celts, and this slide I use frequently when I'm starting. I just want to remind you, because it builds up a picture of who the Scots and the Irish were, and it shows, you know, how the Scots came from the Irish in a sense. You may be aware, is there a pointer of any kind I want to use? Well, it's okay, I'll use it. You may be aware that the Celts are first identified as Celts in Central Europe. In this area up in the headwaters of the Danube. We've talked about that. I think I've talked about that with some of you before. About 800 BC, the Celts, 900 BC, the Celts sort of identified by linguists and prehistorians as Celts. And you may remember that there were two main phases of Celtic culture. The first, called the Hallstatt, Hallstatt phase, and the second, that ran from, about 800 BC to about 400 BC. And the second phase of Celtic culture is called the Latène, Latene, and well, that ran until about, I suppose, the year of our Lord or something like that, on the continent anyway. Now, waves of Celts from both of these periods, or groups, if you will, moved out all across Europe, including going to the British Isles. And you should also know that there were two main divisions of language amongst the Celts, because that's background for what I'll be trying to explain. Some spoke what is referred to as Q-Celtic, or Goidelic, Goidelic. Some linguists, I stress some, because there's an awful lot of speculation and not very much in the way of absolute conclusion from this, but some linguists think that Q-Celtic was the language of the earlier Hallstatt phase of Celtic culture that lived on into the second phase. The Irish and Scottish Gaelic are Q-Celtic or Goidelic languages, or Gaelic languages, if you will. Other Celts spoke what is called P-Celtic or Brythonic, B-R-Y-T-H-O-N-I-C, sometimes B-R-I-T-H-O-N-I-C. Now, these linguists would have this as the language of the later Latène Celts. In our day, the people of Brittany and the people of Wales speak a P-Celtic language. Now, there's some speculation, you know, that the Hallstatt Celts, the earliest phase of Celts, that they came to Britain first, bringing with them that Q-Celtic Gaelic language, settled in Ireland, maybe in parts of the main island of Britain, but were driven out. And then later on, the P-Celts, the Brythonic speakers came, the Latène Celts, the last phase of Celtic, or the second phase of Celtic civilization. That these people came to Britain second and settled mainly on the main island. But that's pure speculation. They really don't know enough to associate Q-Celtic with the earlier group of Celts and P-Celtic with the second group. There's no question but that there were these two language groups. Now, you know that the Romans conquered Britain, and that the Britain before the Romans came was entirely Celtic. That the Romans, they occupied Britain from about 43 to about 410 A.D. And they occupied, well, over here, they occupied about up to here with little bits of Scotland. They occupied parts, but not all of Wales. They didn't get to Ireland. The Romans didn't. Anyway, they brought Pax Romana, the Roman peace, to parts of Britain, and sort of kept some of the more unruly Celts in the Scotland and certainly in Ireland at bay for quite a while, for hundreds of years. But eventually, another group began to grow in prominence on the continent, the Germanic people, and they began to make, as you know, inroads into Roman territory. They got to Italy itself, and eventually the Roman Empire had to contract, and specifically for our purposes, about 410 AD, the Roman legions left Britain. Now they left a Britain that was still entirely, well, after they left, was entirely, again, Celtic. The main island, Brythonic-speaking Celtic, British-speaking Celtic, and the Ireland itself, of course, Gaelic-speaking, Goidelic-speaking. And, you know, I said before, I might think, oh, wonderful, the Celts get Britain back, but the Celts embarked on one of their many periods of infighting and so forth, and the Scots from above the Hadrian's Wall began to go down into Britain and attack and so forth, and the Irish began to attack the whole coast of western the main island, and with making little footholds here and there along the coast. This is the period when from Wales and Cornwall, in these areas, settlers went back over to the continent. Celts went back over to the continent and founded Brittany, which is, as I said, is a P-Celtic language. Brittany, because they came from Britain. It's also the period, unfortunately, that because of what started to go on, all of the chaos, movement of peoples and everything in there, it's the time when, well, at least according to the stories, if you can call it history, some bright Celtic hero got the idea of inviting the Anglo-Saxons over to keep peace for him. And, of course, you know the rest of the story there. So Britain was left in a political vacuum. No one really in charge. And although it was all Celtic again, their inability to get along with each other and form some kind of unified state or states resulted in a whole lot of movement back and forth in various ways. Okay, now I don't want to... And it was also the period when this group of Irish Gaelic speakers came from Ireland, and I guess I can switch this off now because I'm not going to be referring to that anymore. But it was the period when the group of when the Irish takeover that I'm going to talk about was effected. Now, judging from the extent of Roman remains, I mean archaeological remains in Scotland, and from contemporary written sources, a certain amount of Romanization took place in the area that is now Scotland, especially between, if I can find Hadrian's Wall, I guess it's along here. Hadrian's Wall is here, and the Antonine Wall is here. So within this area, especially closer to Hadrian's Wall, but also up in this area, and to some more limited extent, a little further north than that, there was some Romanization. But after the Romans departed Britain, Scotland was left an entirely British-speaking, Brythonic-speaking, Celtic, but different from our kind of Gaelic language-speaking area, controlled by a number of different tribes of Celts. They themselves did some raiding, as I've said, into what is now England, and the Irish made forays. And this was the time when this section of Scotland's coast. Now, I want to show you. Get yourself sort of oriented. This is Ireland, of course, down here. So you're talking about the area. The area we're talking about is the area nearest to the coast of Ireland, except not down in this area. But generally speaking, the part of Scotland that's today referred to as Argyll, which means, I've seen various attempts at it, but the Gael part of it anyway certainly means Gael. So it's either coast of the Gaels or just land of the Gaels or something like that. But anyway, as I'm sure all of you know, this group that came from Ireland and lived in an area, and George, you identified the counties for me earlier, Antrim and Derry, is that right? In Ireland, in this area up here in the northeastern part of Ireland. That was an area that was called Dalriada. Dalriada. Now I asked, my Gaelic is almost non-existent, but I spoke to Professor Watson, and that is the accepted pronunciation of the area, although I've heard Dalriada used in Scotland fairly frequently, because in Scotland, more often than not, it gets changed to one word spelled D-A-L-R-I-A-D-A, but in Ireland you'll see D-A-L and then another word, R-I-A-T-A or R-I-A-D-A. Anyway, they came from that area of Scotland. And now, of course, you've got to get the perspective of the map. I tried with my ruler. Some of you may answer this question for me, but let me take a stab at it first. If my judging from the measure here is right, the distance from the Mull of Kintyre at the bottom of the Kintyre Peninsula and the nearest point on the Irish coast would be somewhere between, well, it would be a little more than the distance from Borden to Tormentine and a little less than the distance from Wood Islands to Pictou, which would make it, you know, somewhere in the order, as far as I could figure out with very rough measure, of 15 miles, something like that. Is that approximately right? So you can imagine that, you know, there's no big surprise that some Irishmen went to Scotland or that Scots ever went to Ireland because, you know, anybody who went out in a boat, especially we're talking about a period about 500 or 600 AD, anybody who went out in a boat, if the wind blew in the wrong direction, would end up probably in Ireland when he wanted to be in Scotland, or in Scotland when he wanted to be Ireland. I mean, there's just no doubt but that both would be entirely visible from the others. So there was bound to be. In fact, I'm speaking principally about one particular period of history, but the first human habitation in Ireland after the Ice Age, well, the first ever, I guess one could say, is up in that area of Ireland, up in this corner, and is assumed to have come from Scotland. So if I wanted to wear a different hat tonight, I would say Yazal came from Scotland. Anyway, you know, this would be way back, probably in the early Stone Age, that this I'm talking about. And of course, down through the years, you know, the plantation the Scots put over into Ulster, which has resulted in the problems of today, and the Clyde, the Irish come into the Clyde Valley to work in the shipyards, Sean Connery and others like him. You know, there's been movement many times and at many periods across this intervening area. I'm speaking about one particular time because I think it's especially significant. So at this time, about 500, 550 AD, the people began to move over from Dalriada or Dalriada in Ireland to the coast of Argyll. And it's a little difficult to know in what numbers they came. And George, God bless him, changed my title when he put it in the paper. I had said the Irish takeover of Scotland, and he put it in the paper as the Irish settlement of Scotland or something, colonization of Scotland, you know. And, you know, George is too valuable for me to get too angry at or anything like that. But he was being diplomatic on my behalf. In fact, I think probably my title is the more accurate because it wasn't a takeover in the sense that hordes. This is the point of my evening, looking at my notes when I started to think about hordes of Irishmen. You know what? It wasn't a time when vast numbers of Irish crossed the intervening waters there and, you know, drove everyone out of Scotland or anything like that. It was a takeover in a cultural and in a linguistic sense. I mean, there had to be political power involved, but there doesn't necessarily have to be large numbers of people in order to effect a cultural takeover. And the Celts, you know, in early Celtic history, there are all kinds of times when the archaeologists and the prehistorians, they wonder how many Celts actually went to northern Spain or even in some cases to the British Isles. Because all you need is a horde of gung-ho military types to come in and take over an area of relatively peaceful farmers, let's say, and impose their own will on them and maybe their own language, and you've got a takeover, but not exactly an occupation and a settlement. something like the Normans. My assumption is of what little I know, but the Norman kind of near takeover with the French language and everything of England and parts of Scotland and Ireland. Now, it wasn't that they were in great large numbers, it's that they won a military victory and that they were the establishment for quite a while. So, really, why the Irish went to Scotland at that period of time, the old phrase, greener pastures, but if you know Ireland and you know that part of Scotland, I don't know whether the pastures were greener or not, but in some respects, I suppose, maybe pressure of population at home, opportunities to raid areas in the coast. God knows there could be any number of reasons, and another important one that will come up later on connected with religion. But for whatever reason, we can speculate on it, we don't have to know. There was a group, a powerful group of Irish who went over to Scotland, settled in that area, and eventually you're going to get this takeover of Scotland because of that. Takeover in a linguistic and a cultural sense, at least. Now, the language takeover, that question of, one might say, well, prove that there was a takeover of Scotland or something like that. Well, no proof is needed for the takeover of language. I mean, there is plenty of evidence to indicate that all of the Celts in Scotland, although there were different groups of them, were P-Celtic speakers. And the languages were not interchangeable. Now, again, I'm no linguist, believe me, but and maybe some of you have had experience of listening to a Welshman, an Irishman, Irish Gaelic speaker, a Scottish, I've heard lots of Scottish Gaelic when I was growing up and so forth, and Irish Gaelic, thanks to Padraig O'Shiel and others, but certainly a Welshman and a Highland Scot or an Irishman cannot speak interchangeably. There's just no way in which P-Celtic and Q-Celtic speakers could speak to each other. There would be the odd word here and there. My father tells the story of going to work in New York when he was a kid, and he worked for the French line and being down in a bar or something like that. I think that was part of the story. And hearing French sailors talking, and all of a sudden he realized he could understand a couple of words. He understood a couple of words they were saying, and my father had absolutely no French. And then he realized they were Breton sailors using a P-Celtic language that is theirs. But anyway, there's modern Scotland, in the period just after the one I'm talking about was Gaelic speaking pretty well all over, and it had not been Gaelic speaking before that. The only group that there's some speculation about the Picts, the so-called Picts, which I'll talk about a little later, about their language. There's really not a lot known about the Pictish language, but what is known, the evidence that is known by almost common consent, suggests that it was a P-Celtic language with maybe some pre-Celtic words thrown in, but it's almost certainly not a Q-Celtic language. So that the Irish effected a takeover linguistically of Scotland, there's no question. Now, of course, later on down the road, unfortunately, Gaelic didn't keep its dominance in Scotland, but other things stayed, and I'll make cases for that. The influence in folklore and religion, along with material culture, are complicated because even before the Irish came over, there were many cultural similarities. Now, I said that Q and P Celtic were not interchangeable, but there were many elements of Celtic culture that the Irish would have shared with the Brythonic Scots. So when you look at material culture, like carvings and metalwork and so forth, it's not quite as easy to establish the Irish influence as it is when you look at language or when you look at folklore. And I'll read you just a couple of little things later on, some of them gathered even in Cape Breton to illustrate that, because both were Celtic. At any rate, imagine Scotland in about, well, say 600, 700 AD. I think I have, well, I'll wait a minute for the slide. But you have a Gaelic-speaking, you have an area with Gaelic-speaking Scots in this area, essentially. You have another area, well, I don't need my notes to get to this. You have another area to the north and to the east of P-Celtic speakers that are referred to by the Romans as the Picts, so that word has come down. You have another group of P-Celtic speakers called the usually referred to as the Strathclyde Britons, down in this area, below Glasgow, say south of Glasgow. And then over in the area from Edinburgh south to the English border, I guess, was sort of a mixture of some P-Celtic speakers and some English speakers. So this is Scotland at that time. The maneuverings and alliances and struggles and conquests, intermarriages and so forth, that one can trace over the next years, that saw the Gaelic speakers eventually gain enough political power and influence to effect this takeover, so that at least for a time in Scottish history, the country was a Gaelic country entirely, an Irish, you might say, country entirely. I've lost myself here. Oh, these maneuverings, it's not something that I'm going to go into in any detail. I mean, as you go down through the years, the Picts will be in league with these people against these and these against. There's just a whole complex of maneuverings and power struggles and rises and falls of various kingdoms and so forth. Complicating matters is that south of the Hadrian's Wall, I guess, south of what we know today as the English border, were English kingdoms as well, which sometimes at least entered into this kind of power struggle up here. And complicating things further still, as most of you know, were eventually raids in the north and along the west coast from the Vikings. And that did a variety of things, like, sometimes bring these people together for protection against them and so forth, although sometimes they were in league. And it even gets as complicated as the Danes in Ireland and Danes in northern England vying with each other for the thing. So there's no sense trying to trace the ups and downs of all of these various little groups of people. My point is that eventually the Gaels, the Irish Gaels in that part of Scotland that we know today as Argyll, eventually won out. Now, certainly one of the factors that the Gaels had going for them was the unifying power of the Celtic Church. Gates and the way they cut their hair and things like that, but not too significant. But anyway, it was a little bit different. And if one is looking for a reason for the takeover, or because going up to these islands was one impetus for going to Scotland. The Celtic Church, one of its characteristics was, and I think Professor Power was talking about this, but they loved to go out into remote islands, and build themselves monasteries and hovels of various kinds, and commune, I suppose, I'm sure, with God and with God through nature and so forth. So, needless to say, the west coast of Scotland afforded lots of islands if one wanted to find isolation and a place for contemplation. There were lots of places. So the Celtic Church provided an impetus for the Irish to come to Scotland. And it also provided, I think, a kind of energy and unifying force that helped the Gaels to take over from the Picts especially, and then eventually from others. And it would run, the argument would run something like this, that the Gaelic speakers were Christian. The Dalriadic Irish who came over were Christian when they came over. An important figure is going to arrive on the scene who's very, very powerful, and we'll talk about him. But the Picts were not Christian for the most part, but the Celtic Church came along and converted the Picts. And once they were converted, of course, the Picts would have associated Christianity with the Gaelic language, because that's where it came from. So it's sort of like the strength of Latin, even though a dead language, because it was used in the Mass and so forth. It provides that kind of impetus. So I suppose that one of the reasons why the church is important in this whole process is because it gave an added authority to the Gaelic language and not to the Pictish, Celtic language and so forth. Now, the seeds, ironically, the seeds of the Irish monastic system can be found actually in Wales and in Scotland, but we don't have to go into that, and I'm not trying to suggest that it wasn't the Irish monastic system. The Irish made it their own and developed a character in their church that gave it a special and recognizable flavor, and one of these things was this desire to get yourself some isolation and so forth. If we subscribe to the great man theory of history, we might conceivably find the reason for the Gaelic takeover of Scotland to be the work of one man, one of these Irish Christians, one of these Irish monks who came to Scotland, called St. Columba, or Columkill, as he referred to in Gaelic. Now, Columba was an Irish priest, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you much about him, but he was an Irish priest of royal connections, who, after a rather distinguished career in Ireland itself, he didn't come to Scotland until he was in his 40s, apparently, got himself into some kind of, I guess you could call it maybe political trouble, by backing the wrong side. And we don't have to go into the reasons or the details of that, but in a controversy and inciting the wrong side to violence, I guess the side that eventually lost. And some say he was either banished or sought self-imposed sort of exile in Scotland. In truth, there are an awful lot of details about St. Columba, as there are about St. Patrick, that are rather speculative. But nevertheless, he did come to the island. He's supposed to have started up the coast of Scotland in May of 563 A.D. and stopped at various islands, presumably setting out from here, stopped at various islands along the way, looking back at Ireland every time. And when he got, the story is, when he got to an island from which he could no longer see Ireland, he said, okay, this is it, this is what I've been looking for. Not that he had any hatred by any means, on the contrary, of Ireland, but this was, after all, a religious movement, and a religious move. He was punishing himself or being punished for what he had done. So, anyway, that may or may not be accurate, but it's stories that are told about him. So that island happened to be, this one conveniently marked in red right here, and that is, of course, Iona. This is Mull, the larger island of Mull, and that's the island of Iona, which is certainly one of the most important religious sites of religious significance for the British Isles, Christians in the British Isles in general, whether they be Anglicans or Presbyterians or Catholics or what have you. It's certainly one site that is honored for reasons that are pretty obvious. So it's become one of the sacred places of British Christianity. The Gaels who came to Scotland were apparently Christian already, so Columba ministered to them. But only a few of the Picts were Christianized. So he set about to Christianize the Picts, and there are, the whole books of stories, call them folklore or whatever, about Columba vying with the Druids and doing various things. I think he even put down the Loch Ness Monster at one stage of the game. So, how many of these things were just speculation or not. Columba must have been an extraordinary man, given the number of stories and prayers and everything that have come down about him, certainly in Scottish tradition, and I suspect in Irish tradition as well. I think I'll just read you one little bit if I can from, because it pervades everything that you read. These are excerpts from a book called the Carmina Gadelica, which is a collection of Highland Scottish songs, spiritual songs mostly, collected in the Hebrides and in also in neighboring parts of Scotland. This one's called the Day of St. Columba. Thursday of Columba benign, day to send sheep on prosperity, day to send cow on calf, day to put the web in the warp, day to put coracle on the brine, day to place the staff to the flag. He pervades the whole of their life. And if I could just read you just a little snippet from something else called Columba's Herding. You know, these were ordinary people who were using these prayers. May the herding of Columba encompass you going and returning, encompass you in strath and on ridge and on the edge of each rough region. May it keep you from pit and from mire, keep you from hill and from crag, over and over and over and over again. And there are all kinds of them in here. He must have been an extremely important, influential man for the Gaelic, the Irish Celts who came to Scotland. Anyway, as a result of the work of St. Columba and others, by 843 AD, because they now had Christianity in common, the Picts and the Scots united under a man called Kenneth MacAlpine, who had been MacAlpine, if you will, who had been king of the Scots and became king of the Picts as well. And Scotland was on its way to unity. Now, with the union of the Picts and the Scots, the center for Gaelic Scotland moved, I'm not going to go into this, but moved east. And, you know, you get areas in this part of Scotland starting to become prominent, even for the Gaels in there. And anyway, that's not to say that the Irish are still not influencing, because they carried the language, the influence brought the language and the culture with it. And eventually, it took over pretty well all of Scotland. Now, I want to show you just a few slides, and then I'm going to come back to my notes just a little bit at the end. I'll do these rather quickly, but I want to show you at least the two places that are kind of significant for the Irish Gaels who came to Scotland, or most significant, I guess you could say. Well, yeah, wait, no. Okay. That's just a map showing the various movements of people, the Irish over to this area of Scotland, the English up this way, the Norse down that way, and so forth. So we've talked about that. I won't go into it. Oh, well, I guess I was. This is in writing his books about the glorious Highlanders and so forth. He earned a little bit of money. This is his summer cottage, Abbotsford. No, this is his home, really, on the in the Scottish borders area, near Melrose. Is that right? In Scotland. Now this is, if I can get it, this is something called Dunad Fort. It's just on the edge. No, I'll show it to you in a minute. You're looking at it. It's over in the background there. But I show it to you because it's the capital, really. It's at the neck, I guess you could say, of the Kintyre Peninsula. And it's supposed to be the fort, the hill fort where the Irish, the Gaels who came to that part of Scotland, made their first capital. And it doesn't look very large from there. You get up top of it, it looks a little big. Typical Highland cattle there, as you can see, and my rental car in the back. There's himself at Dunad Fort, just to prove I was there. And, well, Dunad was the capital of the Scots of Dalriada, occupied intermittently from the 6th to the 9th centuries. An outstanding example of a Dark Age fortification, and very significant for Irish-Scottish connections. Oh, sadly, that's a rather dark slide, so you can't quite get the impression that I'd like to get of the rock walls of the fort looking from up above down onto the plain. Some of you know have seen before examples of these Celtic hill forts. And this you're almost, but don't worry about it, because the only thing I wanted to show you is this. That's a footprint And they speculate that it must have had some significance. Okay, you can see it. Thank you. You can see it better there. It must have had some significance, and they talk about crowning, or, well, it's not exactly crowning, I guess, but maybe something like Cinderella. I don't know. God knows, but they speculate that maybe the king of the Irish in that part of Scotland might have, had to put his foot in there. God knows. Maybe he turned into a pumpkin or something. And just to tell you that other parts of Scotland, of course, that's where the Irish, Dunad Fort is where you go looking for the Irish. This is, anybody recognize that? Some of you have been to Scotland. Pardon me? No, it's not Loch Ness. That's the Clyde River, actually, looking downriver, I guess. Dumbarton, right. That's that's the hill fort of the Strathclyde Gaels. That was the capital of the P-Celtic Gaels, sorry, not Gaels, the P-Celtic people who lived between the Clyde and the English borders. And this is the capital over on the other side of Edinburgh of the P-Celtic people who lived between Edinburgh and the English borders. I'm going to go on very quickly. Brendan, I think, Brendan is going to Iona very, very soon. So I just wanted one day, and sadly only for a day, my wife and I went out to see Iona. So this was in Oban on the Scottish mainland, where you get the ferries for a lot of the Hebrides. That's Caledonia McBrain, is that right? Can that be correct? The company? I think that's right. B-R-A-Y-N-E? Anyway, those are the ferries that you get to go out to the various Hebridean islands. And that's Oban as we were on our way out. I'm just going to do this. And the Misty Islands on the way, this was just, I don't know where that was. I just took a castle, a lonely castle on a misty Scottish island is what it represented to me. Then now that's, let's see, that's Mull in the background, which is a very large island. This is the little ferry that you take to go across there. It's actually not quite as far as it looks. It's only about a mile or two across. And this is on Iona. And then, I wanted to show Brendan where there's a bookstore. Mike, there's a bookstore there. And then, of course, the typical Celtic crosses. And if you're looking to establish the Irish presence on the coast of Scotland, I mean, where else but Iona? If not Dunad, where else but Iona will you see crosses that you can find examples of all over Ireland itself? And that was not the ferry we came on, but looking down from Iona toward Mull. Pretty desolate country. Iona is a beautiful island in many respects, but it's not pastoral or anything like that. And that was, well, you can't see it, but I put over in the wall over there a little poster which you can look at after of the, that's not Columba's Abbey by any means. That would be, hundreds and hundreds of years after Columba. This is, I think, a Benedictine Abbey, but Columba's, as Professor Power explained, would just have been little wattle, probably hovels and things like that. This is Deer Abbey. I just wanted to illustrate that the Celtic Church, the Celtic Christians moved up into other parts of Scotland. I think Deer Abbey, I can't see in the dark. It's one of these. I think that's it here, but I wouldn't swear to it. I can't. My eyes are. Anyway, it was an example of Celtic Irish influence in Scotland as well. The Abbey of Deer, well, we went 1219, but it was on the site of an earlier Celtic Christian church. And this is in England, actually, but it's also Celtic. They came from Iona, they went up to Deer, all over the Hebrides, and down, if I can find it, to Holy Island down there, Lindisfarne, and they established a Celtic monastery down there. So their influence, the influence of Irish Christians, Columba and the church he established, was very pervasive. I suspect my time is going. So. That's just a Pictish stone of earlier type, but I just wanted to show you that the Picts eventually got into this Irish type of Celtic type, but no doubt influenced by the Irish Christians. And that once the Picts were Christianized, they ended up, doing this kind of sculpture. That's a broch, but I'm not going to get into that because I have to finish off. I'm going to be, George will have me trouble. And there's himself at a broch, just off the Isle of Skye, really, on the mainland, opposite the Isle of Skye. This stone structure, which I think I was going, if I were to go into it, I'd illustrate that there's a whole tradition of stone building amongst the Celts right up the eastern coasts of the west coast of Europe. I keep getting my coasts mixed up. From Portugal and Spain, right up through Ireland, Brittany, and here you find it in Scotland, amongst the Gaels. And there's herself, all French, French to the core. Oh, that's in Portugal. I didn't realize I put that in. That's just to illustrate that the same kind of construction. These are not two Portuguese ladies, that's wife and daughter. Now, Professor Power, I didn't come to his lecture, I confess, but I borrowed the tape, and he was talking about the monastic tradition, the Book of Kells and so forth, and all. He showed you, I thought from the tape he was showing you slides, and you saw various kinds of reliquies and so forth, and pages perhaps in the Book of Kells. And what I would be trying to illustrate here, if we had a lot of time to go into it, would be the extent to which the same tradition is found in Scotland. Unfortunately, a lot of the metal work that must have come over from Ireland to Scotland or was done by the Irish on the coast of Scotland was carried away by the Danes, much of it, by the Vikings. Much of it is found in Norway and Denmark rather than in Scotland. But anyway, this is obvious. If you look at the intricate interweavings and interlacings there, you'll see a perfect example of what Professor Power was talking about in the Irish monastic tradition. But this is Scottish. And there's a reliquary. I think he talked about that. They would put relics of saints, and that too is Scottish, and I think it's referred to as the reliquary of Columba. And that, just to remind you, I think that's the last slide, I hope is from the Book of Kells itself. And I think, if I got his lecture correctly, he did mention that the Book of Kells was at least started in Iona, if not finished there and then taken to Kells. They just don't know. Certainly not in Columba's time. It's later than Columba, but the monastery continued on after Columba. So I guess if we wanted to argue about whether it was Scottish or Irish, my point tonight would be, it sure as heck is Irish in influence, in spirit, in almost every respect, because the Highland Scots were Irish, at least at that period of time, if not now, in almost every respect. A few Viking, probably little Viking activity to the contrary. So the Book of Kells, one can argue whether it was made in Scotland or not. It was made by the same people, I guess is what I'm trying to say. If St. Patrick is an Irishman, then Columbus is a Scotchman. St. Patrick was born British Celt, not an Irish Celt. Well, Columba was born in Ireland, but he made his mark mostly in Scotland. So, I mean, my point is not that we're going to argue over them, because, please God, we're the same people anyway in many respects. So, just to show you that the Vikings, this is a little chess set of Viking construct that I just show you to remind you that there are other people around, I guess. And oh yes, in a house in Edinburgh, picture of John Knox. We've talked about the Celtic Church, which I guess would be essentially Catholic. I'm going to make a little argument when I turn off on the lights again about why we should all look back at these early Gaels and the Celtic Church as a unifying force. I guess I gave the last word to John Knox. He was wont to take it if you gave it to him or not anyway. So I guess I'll just make my concluding remarks. Okay. I want to read first. Now, you might, if I were talking to a bunch of Ukrainians or something like that who happen to be interested in history, I might have to make my points a little stronger to prove what I'm trying to say, that the Highland Scots were in very many respects still retain their Irishness. And if I were trying to prove it to them, I might pick up this book, which is known to a good number of you perhaps. It's called, in English, Tales Until Dawn, and it was gathered by John Shaw, who has lectured to us in the past. And it's a book of shorts of folk tales gathered from mostly from a man called Joe Neal McNeill in Cape Breton. Happy to say, Joe Neal McNeill was a friend of the family, although I didn't remember him very, very well, I must confess, as an adult. And I'm also happy to say that my grandparents and other relatives appear in this book. But here's a story that I noted for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. It's called The Death of Dermot. Now, here's a Cape Bretoner, ill-educated, you know, not a fellow who was likely to have run across all kinds of books of Irish folktales or anything like that. He had to leave school at a very early age. When I say ill-educated, I mean formally. The man is, I wish I were half as smart as he is. But, you know, he just did not have education. So these things had come down to him in an unbroken oral tradition from the Irish heroic period and so forth. And, pardon me? Well, thousands of years, I guess, literally, and worked it out. And, you know, probably because of some of the ironies of fate, a lot of the Irish were assimilated to English more than the Highland Scots were at some stages anyway. And the Gaelic speakers in Cape Breton would be an example of people who were not assimilated. And ironically, you as Irish could go to Joe Neal McNeill and get some stories that they're right in, you know, they're straight from Joe Neal McNeill's heart and from thousands of years of his ancestors, but they're also your stories. Because Dermot, of course, was from Ireland, and I found from Professor Watson that he was from down in the south west corner of Ireland. Anyway, Dermot, any woman who saw Dermot could not help but fall in love with him. And it seemed that Finn's wife fell deeply in love with Dermot. Some of you know the story. She felt a great longing for him, and that caused Finn to harbor malice toward Dermot, because Finn's wife had departed with Dermot. And it seemed that Finn took the matter to heart, that he intended to put Dermot to death. He did not want to have a hand, but he didn't want to have a hand in the death of Dermot. So he made created this situation. Finally, he sent Dermot to kill a poison, I can't read that side of the page, it's in Gaelic, make the mistake, to kill a poison boar somewhere, the story says. I'm sure that he tried many ways before to kill him, but it was not easy. Dermot was so stalwart. But he was sent to kill a poison boar. They expected when he went to hunt down the poison boar that it would finish him, and Finn would not be blamed. But Dermot killed the poison boar and still harbored a good deal of... And Finn was not satisfied. Dermot was still alive. Finn still harbored a good deal of malice toward him. He had run off with Grania, is that her name? Grania? Finn nursed his intense hatred toward Dermot, and even though Dermot was so heroic as to kill the poison boar, Finn was not happy that he had not met his death. So he saw fit that Dermot would measure the boar, and the boar was to be measured along its length. The measure was to be done by foot lengths, heel to toe, from one end to the other. Dermot began measuring the boar at its head, and he measured it down to the other end. That is, from the snout to the nose of the pig down to the tail. Once he had done that, he was asked to measure back again. Measuring that way, he was going against the direction of the bristles. Now, what was called a door of death on the sole of Dermot's foot, there was on the sole of Dermot's foot, and if any venomous point should penetrate it, he would die. As he was going up to the pig, Dermot stepped on the poison bristle, which penetrated the door of death, and he started to die, started to expire, and he called to Finn or something. Finn went, he said, if I have some water, I'll survive or something. Finn went and took water in his hands and tried to get it to him, but it slipped out of his hands, and he realized that he was still angry at him, and the next time he got the water, he opened his fingers or something like that. But my point is not anything about that particular story, but, you know, there's Irish, there's thousands of years of your history from a Highlander from Cape Breton. Now that story has particular interest for me. Why? See if there, that would have particular interest for a Campbell, because the Campbell is called Clan Dermot, and they trace themselves back to Dermot, supposedly, mythologically. They trace themselves back to this Irish hero. And I have in my office a crest with a Clan Campbell crest with a wild boar right in the center of it. And, so, you start thinking about these things and the interconnections of these things, and you start asking, well, just a minute, am I Irish or am I Scots? These things go back into Irish tradition so long that I think the point is made. It is sad to see the disunity today in the Celtic world. As far as Celtic unity is concerned, it would be better, I've said this before, perhaps in here, better if the Reformation had never taken place or had gone all the way. Take your pick. The memory of Ireland's role as a very important mother country for Scotland should help to ease the tensions that the religious difference, the religious split between some of the Scots and other Scots, and the Irish and the Scots, some of the Irish and the other, that has created, of course, a lot of friction to add to our tendency as Celts to be warring with each other anyway. So the memory of Ireland's role as a very important mother country for Scotland should help to ease tensions, say, between the Ulster Scots and the Irish. But it doesn't seem to count for anything. Even the Celtic Church, which eventually lost its separate identity as it was brought back into the Roman Catholic fold at the Council of Whitby in 664, should provide some common ground, since Presbyterians are attracted to its asceticism, its strictness, and they see in it a means of acknowledging their roots in Catholic Christianity without having to acknowledge Rome, which is important to them. Catholics are attracted to the Celtic Church to its espousal of the virtues of life close to nature, and they too, Celtic Catholics, tend to be quite puritanical, Jansenistic themselves. So it should be a source of unity, and I guess I'm saying let's remind ourselves that it should be a source of unity. Celts have never been famous for their ability to avoid divisiveness, so perhaps we can't hope for too much. We ourselves, however, can be aware of our common heritage, and Scots no longer need to hide from themselves their debt to Ireland and their brotherhood or sisterhood with the Irish. If the Gaelic heritage is important in defining what a Scotchman is, then Scots had best embrace and honor Irish culture, lest they discover themselves to be engaged in self-hatred. One little bit at the end. According to the rule of Columba, I'm coming to the end. According to the rule of St. Columba, the rule of St. Columba, the regulations developed to govern the conduct of his monks, but which certainly should have some influence over us this evening. You're cautioned against allowing into your midst, quote, a person who would talk with thee in idle words, or about matters of this world. I hope my talk has not been overly worldly. It may become idle if I continue much longer. But I would like to end with a few words of Highland Scottish prayer recorded in the Highlands by that same Alexander Carmichael and set down in his famous Carmina Gadelica, recorded in the Hebrides. This is Scottish to the core, but not out of place, I would suggest, in the benevolent Irish Society Hall. On the day of the three kings on high, subdue to us the crest of the waves. On Beltane Day, give us the dew, Beltane being a Celtic, interesting pagan insertion there. On John's Day, the gentle wind. The day of Mary the Great of fame, ward off the storm from the west. On the feast day of Bride, day of my choice, that's capital Bride, and the Irish are familiar with her. Cast ye the serpent into the ocean, so that the sea may swallow her up. And on the feast day of Patrick, day of power, one day past, reveal to us the storm from the north, quell its wrath and blunt its fury, lessen its fierceness, subdue its cold. And from the same collection, and this should sound very familiar to you if you're Irish, but I'm sorry, it's a Scottish saying or little prayer from the Hebrides, which is obviously chosen to show you our commonality. May God make, this is as we depart for home, may God make safe to you each step. May God make open to you each path. May God make clear to you each road, and may he take you in the clasp of his own two hands. And if that doesn't sound familiar to an Irishman, I don't know what will. Thank you very much. Certainly.
I don't know if it would be safe for me to ask him a question or not.
Depends on.
I'm the fellow from across the street.
Oh. Is that Huey?
That's Huey.
Okay.
Are you saying that that particular group just across the street, that is Q County? The Argyle group is Q County?
Yeah, yes. They were Gaelic speakers like the rest of the Irish. Gaelic speakers, Q Celtic speakers.
Yes.
And they came over to Scotland, and they took over, and linguistically, they took over the whole country, at least for a while. Culturally, they took over. Now, the language died out, but I would argue that most of the many of the trappings that one looks at in considering Scottish identity came with this Gaelic group, especially after Walter Scott. But yeah, the answer to your question is they were Q Celtic speakers, and they brought a different kind of Celtic to Scotland.
That was the answer to one question.
Yeah.
At that time in Scotland, was the political influence Druid influence as well as in Ireland?
Okay. Columba did not bring Christianity to Scotland. I mean, he was not the first to bring Christianity to Scotland. Whitehorn, I won't find it. Whithithorn, it's right there. St. Ninian. God, I won't remember the dates of St. Ninian, but they'd probably be 100 years or so, maybe 500 AD or something like that. I'm just guessing. But before Columbus' time, anyway, St. Ninian had brought Christianity to Scotland.
From Ireland? Christianity as in the Old Testament?
Christianity and pre-Reformation Christianity, I guess that's the best way to put it. And there were other influences. I mean, what St. Ninian had established there was quite influential in Ireland. In fact, the monastic tradition of Ireland supposedly came partly from St. Ninian's influence over here. I forget all of your question there, but what exactly you repeat?
Was prior to that was the say the political and religious influence?
Druid. Sorry, I lost that. The Druid. There are stories of St. Columba confronting the Druids. If one makes the assumption that Julius Caesar and all the other people who comment on the Celts and the traditions that have come down through us, through Irish and Welsh, and to some extent Highland Scottish literature, the Druids certainly were there and were in control. It depends on what you mean or understand by a Druid. You know, and Caesar, of course, Caesar was the arch enemy of the Celts. So he drew the Druids as this evil kind of, sacrificing people all over the place and doing this and that. The Druids were learned. They were medicine men in the best sense. The doctors, to the extent that that medicine was known in those days. I'm sure they had connections with. They knew how to use nature to cure and so forth. So yes, the political influence. Now I better not speak out of turn. The political influence a while before the Irish came, of course, was Romans. You know, the Romans had gone up as far as Benaki. Somewhere up here there's a mountain called Mount Benaki, which is supposed to be the site of the Battle of Mons Gropius. The Romans came up and defeated large numbers of Caledonians up in this area. So there would have been Roman political control over the area, as I was saying, between Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall for a while. But for the most part, there were kingdoms, so the Druids wouldn't have been in total control. There would have been some kind of political tribal structure. The Druids would have been extremely influential, but they wouldn't have been the only influence. Well, in Gaul, for instance, the Druids were thought to be perhaps the only unifying influence, in that the different tribes had their own political structure, but they didn't have any political structure that united them or even allowed them to communicate very much. But the Druids were respected throughout Gaul, and supposedly they gave some kind of unity. So no doubt the Druids were very, very influential in Scotland, as they were in Ireland. Yeah. And there are stories of St. Columba contending with the Druids and one-upping them, you know, doing things that supposedly when he scared away the Loch Ness Monster or something, you know, he converted some of the Pictish kings because they were impressed with this, and the Druids couldn't do it or something like that. But, you know, those are just stories.
Someone asked over here whether St. Ninian was an Irishman.
No, I think St. Ninian. No, I think St. Ninian had come from the Dumbarton area. I think he was a Strathclyde Briton, but again, no, he was not an Irishman. Sorry to say.
I may have missed the dates, but what were you're saying that St. Columba had gone to Scotland around what, 450?
No. Well, I read the date and I can't remember it myself. It would be 6 something.
The Irish influence would have been considerably before that.
Oh yes. The Irish influence would have started, at least by 500, probably before that. There would have been people along there. There were Irish people there when Columba came over. You're right. Yeah, and in fact, there was supposedly some indication that there was even religious activity on Iona before Columba came over. But I suppose Columbus' significance was his influence and his power, you know, his great authority and so forth. He seemed to be able to do things that the previous ones didn't. And he's given credit for at least the major impetus, I guess, in the conversion of the Picts. Although the Picts had been partly converted even before Columbus arrived. Columba arrived. So
because I've been to a Pict burial ground dating back to I guess the last burial would have been about the year 700, and it's off Loch Gill to the west.
What's it called?
It's to the west of Loch Gill.
Okay, I couldn't. Where's Loch Gill?
Just below
Inverary.
Due west of Glasgow.
Yeah, I've been to Inverary, right here.
Yeah,
Okay. And that's supposedly the last Pictish burial?
No, the last Picts that were buried at that old site was about the year 700, and there was Celtic influence there at that time.
Well, the Picts were Celtic now, but there was Irish influence. Oh, certainly. Oh, most certainly.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
an Irish cross there. So.
Yeah, there could very well have been. No, I'm not suggesting that Columba did it all himself. It was done. It had been going on. Christianization had been going on for quite a while, and the Irish were Christian when they went over, apparently. But the Picts had been partly Christianized. You're right. But Columba, especially to the northern Picts, I guess, the southern Picts. The Picts. Now that term Pict is pretty loose, but the area, all this area, most of the Pictish stones, so-called, are found in this area, the vast majority of them. But certainly the Picts must have lived down that way. And that term, I mean, the Romans used the term Pict. It means painted people. But I mean, the Caledonians, all of a sudden the Romans came along, and everybody they used to call Caledonians, they're suddenly calling Picts. But you know, it's a name is a name. But you know, your comment is absolutely right. The Irish were there long before Columbus, and will be there, no doubt, long after. Well,
Any other questions? I wonder, Bob, you made an allusion to it. I wonder if you could maybe elaborate on it, because one of the things that really dramatically shows the connection between the Highland Scots and the Irish is the clan system, and so many of the clans tracing their origin back to Irish kings and so on.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that after a certain stage, I guess, in Scottish history, it became fairly common for people, even if they couldn't. Apparently, I read somewhere the other day, which disturbed me to no end, that the MacDonalds actually can trace their
I didn't want to say that.
But the Campbells, I talked about this one time before. I'm making a great case for the Campbells as Gaels. In fact, the most authoritative source on the genealogy of the Campbells, and I think you've heard me say this before, has it now that the first Campbell was actually Strathclyde Briton, not Gaelic at all, but Brythonic. But, of course, you know, even if he was, and moved up toward Inverary or moved up into the area in Argyll, which one associates with the Campbells. So that, you know, if you go back far enough, but the Campbells had, you know, took themselves back to Adam at one stage of the game. I mean, they created a lineage that, but they were all doing it. I mean, if they couldn't actually do it, and many of them, the oral tradition was so strong that many of them could, even though it wasn't written down, they could give you their ancestry. Rebich Pith or Hamish Pith or Acacan. I can give you my ancestry right back to the first Campbell who came over to the New World, which is what, 7 or some generations ago. So you can imagine what they could have done over there. But I won't get on to the Campbells. But indeed, those lineages go back to Irish history and so forth. Sometime I would like to discuss with you the first part of what I was saying, because in some respects that interested me more as I got into the thing. You know, why is it that we didn't acknowledge our Irish connections quite so much? And I don't know whether you would agree with me that my experience in Cape Breton, whether that was typical or not, that we didn't have as much respect for the Irish as we should have, given our relationship to the Irish. And there may have been religious reasons for that, but I was a Catholic Scot, not a Presbyterian. But, you know, I think that we all, as I was saying, I think we all kind of bought into the British Empire, as many Irish, I guess, did themselves. But we became anti-Irish in our association with the English and so forth. But, I mean, that's just a theory. Maybe I'm imagining my attitudes when I was younger.
I talked to Eugene McCabe, who was over here last fall at that and he was asking me about the Irish on the island and how, you know, what way they were educated and were they given any Irish history. And I was telling him that when I was growing up, it wasn't something you bragged about. Maybe you weren't ashamed of it, but you certainly didn't, you learned something about your own family, about your own people, but you didn't get now maybe it was different in some of the, outlying communities where they were largely Irish, but certainly that was my experience, that you felt a little bit, not ashamed, but as if you just weren't quite, up to scratch in many ways. And he said it's the national, not feeling, but anyway, that's one of the big problems with the Irish is this inferior feeling that they've come to accept the subjugation.
Sure.
That they've done.
Yeah. And if you put yourself in the place of the Highland Scots, suddenly with the necessity and maybe the opportunity to get themselves into the military, into the whole British machine in ways that the Irish couldn't do, weren't allowed to do, or didn't want to do, or whatever, it must have been terribly tempting, to adopt all of the attitudes and the so forth. And The first Campbell went back to Duncan was the first Campbell. His brother who came over, they both came over about 1800, something like that. He was called, and this Duncan the Drummich or something in the Gaelic, which was Duncan the Drummer. So he must have been in the military. I mean, we know absolutely nothing about what they did in Scotland or anything, other than the fact that they came from Barra. But he must have been one of these. Now that would be, what, 55 years, 54 years or something after Culloden. But the Highlander, it's amazing, it's even disheartening at times to see how quickly the Highlanders, after they were devastated after Culloden and put to the sword and fire and everything else, how quickly they had to or did allow themselves to be co-opted into, so that they're fighting at Quebec and everything, fighting the battles. And there are documented evidence from James Wolfe himself, and you've probably heard this before. James Wolfe writing to another British officer, let's get the Highlanders into the front of it, because they're, it doesn't take too many Scotchmen to make a horde either, because they're tough. And what does it matter? Quote, exact quote from James Wolfe, what does it matter if they fall? So there they were, getting themselves co-opted, but of course the English weren't quite looking on them as gloriously as they hoped to be looked on by the English. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, that's right.
I personally wondered from time to time about this co-option thing, and I wondered about whether this was a possible scenario. Most of the Scottish clan chiefs stayed with their land. They were, by and large, co-opted by the system. They got their lands back to them through the British system, from the British Crown, in exchange for loyalty. They by and large stayed in Scotland. What happened in Ireland was that the clan chiefs left. Now that was good and it was bad. In Scotland, when the chiefs were co-opted, the clans went along with them. Mm-hmm. In Ireland, the chiefs were gone. They weren't co-opted. And so the clans in Ireland, the chiefs were not there for the Irish to follow. Mm-hmm. And so they weren't co-opted in the same way. I don't know if there's anything in that at all, but I've wondered along the lines that that's an explanation for the way things went.
I guess, well, God knows how religion played a part in it too. I mean, the fact is most of the Highland, most of Scotland was Protestant by that time. So it would have been easier for the English to find themselves, allowing the Scots to work their way into the system in a way. And I'm not uttering a prejudice against the English or a diatribe against the English. It simply would have been easier for them to find their way into accepting the Protestant Scots into their system. And I mean, the Catholic Scots didn't necessarily have to reveal themselves as Catholic Scots along the way. But, there are divisions amongst the Scots as well. And in Cape Breton, and I've said this, I think maybe here before, but the Skianach, the Skye Scots were, that term, mainly the Presbyterian Scots, I guess, or at least I've heard, the Badach, I'm not getting the pronunciation very well, but when you hear Badach, see it referred to in Cape Breton literature, if I may be so bold as to suggest that there is such a thing. That refers to the people who come from Barra and like people. They were Catholic Scots, like, I suppose, Jim McNeil. I don't know his background, but he comes from Barra, and like my own people came from Barra. They were Catholic Scots. They were certainly more like the Irish in more respects. But this Carmina, by the way, lest you think I'm quoting Catholic prayers or theology there, the Carmina Gaelica was gathered from Catholic and Presbyterian Highlanders in the 19th century. This is not a Catholic document, and Carmichael, I'd be very surprised if Carmichael himself was Catholic. He's probably more likely to be Presbyterian. So what I'm quoting there is not evidence for Catholic Scots, Catholic Highlanders being like the Irish. It's evidence for the Highlanders being like the Irish. And the only respect in which Presbyterian Highlanders would not be like the Irish would be in that, the Catholic Irish would be in the respect to their religion. But in every other, in their dreams, they behold not only the Hebrides, maybe, but the Aran Islands or something else, you know. Yeah, the Lone Shieling, whatever. Anyway.
Any other questions?
Sir, and what clans are descendants of Fergus MacGregor, the Irish?
Ooh. Of Dermot, did you say? Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Clan Campbell, the Gaelic, in Gaelic is referred to as Clan Dermot, I guess, or something like that. My Gaelic is poor. Clan Dermot, the clan of Dermot. Then they definitely saw themselves as descended from Dermot, who was a great heroic figure. That's why they wanted to see themselves.
And so it's MacDonald descendant?
Oh, well, I can't say much about McDonald's. There are McDonald's in Ireland as well. So, no, I really don't know anything about the lineage. The only thing that Professor Watson told me when I was talking about the wild boar on the Campbell crest, and he said, and I hadn't heard it this way before, but he said the Campbells were referred to as, I think he said, muchich, something like that. Now, much is a pig. And they wouldn't have been, you know, everybody, all the Highlanders would have known that the wild boar was the symbol of the Campbell crest. But when they called them the muchich or whatever it would be, they were. Now the MacDonalds, he said, were the people of the Coo. Coo is dog. Coin or something like that is plural, and the MacDonalds were referred to as people of the dog or something like that. But that's not their lineage. It's just that what Professor Watson mentioned to me.
One mentioned, if you don't know, that the Queen's mother is direct descendant to this person.
Oh, I don't doubt it. Yeah.
And I saw both of the royal line descendant of our Wales. And it's also direct descendant to the Mertons,
Mm-hmm.
of Mertz,
Oh, yeah.
of Wexford,
Right.
the mother. And said that she was descended German from Mertz.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that the royal family, in some respects, can trace itself back to this Kenneth MacAlpin, who would be the Scottish, the Irish, the Gaelic king who united the Gaels and the Picts. And supposedly they can date themselves back to there, but there's more German blood than Scottish blood, I'm sure, in them, but and Greek, I guess, and everything else.
Well, if there's no other questions, we'll break for a bite to eat, some coffee and tea. I just remind you that a week from tonight is the last lecture in our series, and that's the traditional time to be set aside for readings from Irish literature. And again, we're going to have Dr. Colin O'Hare, Dr. Brendan O'Grady, and Michael Hennessy reading on that occasion. So we invite you all back a week from tonight. If you want to come up and put some more questions to Mr. Campbell, feel free to do so. We'll keep him here as long as you want. Thank you very much for coming.
How are you? How are you? Did they? Okay. Well, you've got me there. I know that the French certainly held out in England for quite a while, language of the court and so forth. I don't know anything about how much Norman French had anything. But what you say could very well be true. They were what did they speak in the other? Which language? Oh, did they? Must have died out. Chaucer's writing within 200 years, almost the literature in English is being written in Old English rather than Chaucer